the 20 Books to 50Ks panel on military science fiction. For those of you at the panel last year, I had a couple points, but I think they deserve repeating, so I will do that. First of all, military science fiction is the single largest subgenre of science fiction. Yay. So definitely there are readers out there. Sometimes that doesn't translate into respect. When a novelette was nominated for Nebula 2 years ago, there are a lot of people who write about all the nominees, and some of them were rather surprised that military science fiction was even there, and questioned whether military science fiction as a genre deserves to be there. However, other people besides the readers obviously pay attention. The US government, for example, the Marine Corps put together the Science Fiction Futures, a Marine Corps security environmental forecast that asked science fiction writers to forecast how Marines would fight between 2030 and 2045. The Army has the Mad Scientist Initiative, where science fiction writers do basically the same thing. And if we go back to Reagan's SDI, a lot of that was based on Jerry Pournelle's Citizen Advisory Council on National Space Policy. So military science fiction is more than just reading for fun. It actually helps form the future. What I'd like to do now, we have some very august panel here. I'd like to go down. I'll start with Chris. And please introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Chris Kennedy, former naval aviator and elementary school principal, now science fiction and fantasy author, editor, and publisher. Probably the biggest claim to fame is publish and write in the Four Horsemen universe, which currently has 45 books as of Friday, I think.
Thanks, I get to follow that. Hi, I'm Ken Lozito. I am a former IT security analyst, and I write science fiction full-time. And my biggest claim to fame is First Colony series, which doesn't have 45 books, but it does have 9, so that's cool.
Hi, Richard Fox, best known for the Ember Wars series. I've been writing full-time for 4 years, mostly military science fiction with a little space opera thrown in there. Biggest claim to fame is I won the Dragon Award for Best Military Science Fiction Novel back in 2017. So David Weber's got 3, I've got 1. So
yeah, you've got the only one that isn't David Weber. That's right.
Brad R. Torgerson, recently returned from deployment. Biggest claim to fame, I got the Dragon Award for Best Science Fiction Novel for my hard science fiction, military science fiction novel in September, and I'm a POG. Oh, he says say the name. The book is called A Star-Wheeled Sky.
And I'm Jon Brazee. I'm a retired Marine Colonel, full-time writer, mostly of military science fiction. I've got about 75 titles, I guess. I did not win a Dragon Award, but I was a finalist. Lost to Weber, as you did in the same book. I mean, the same award. But I do have a couple of Nebula finalists, and I'm a USA Today bestseller. But we're not here to listen to me. We're here to listen to the panelists. So the first question I'm going to have is exactly what is science fiction? Toni Weisskopf, who's the editor at Bain, she said that military science fiction is written by people who have a clue about how the military actually works, while militaristic science fiction is written by Gene Roddenberry. So I'm going to we're going to start over here, this time with Brad. If you could give your definition of what really makes military science fiction.
Robert A. Heinlein probably set the bar in the beginning, really, for what true, I should introduce the word authenticity. I think that's what a lot of readers pick up on, is the little subtle details of your own military experience that you weave in there. Or if you haven't been in the military, if you can absorb some of that from people you know that are in the military, and you can weave those little subtle details in there. I'm not sure that there's an A to B to C to D guidebook on exactly how to do that right, because each one of you will do it differently, but that's also part of your voice that will emerge in how you do your stories. I myself have tended to focus on not super soldiers, not elite, cutting edge, bearded ninja people. I tend to do the opposite. I tend to focus on people who are just the average person who, as throughout American military history, has been thrust into a terrible and or fantastic situation and has to dig their way out of it through grit and determination, you know. So as opposed to, I guess the best way I could put it is, it's a bit like Legolas or Aragorn, who are clearly born to be these fantastic, amazing people in that story. And then you have Samwise Gamgee, who is this kind of bumbling little guy who has no experience, but he has a lot of heart, right? And in my opinion, that's, if you can put that into your characters, like, I think Tom Clancy did this really well in some of his techno thrillers. And if memory serves, Clancy wasn't even in the military.
No, he wasn't.
Yeah, but he wrote some of the best military fiction I've ever read, ever. If you can get that and do it in such a way that those characters come alive and become real, I almost think your science fiction aspect, I won't say it doesn't matter, but really it's those characters that are going to ring with people. That's what they're going to remember. The science fiction setting is the setting. It's the cinematic wallpaper of your story, but it's the character that I think really is going to stand out.
Hi. So as far as what military science fiction is you have your science fiction setting. You have military members solving a military problem in a military manner. So you have a unit that has orders and acts like they're actually in the military accomplishing something. Now let's kind of let's go back to Star Trek. So everyone in Star Trek has a uniform. They have a rank. They're ostensibly, if I use that word correctly, in the military doing something. But let's think about what's the whole premise of Star Trek. I think, and we all know it by heart. You know, these are the voyages of the Starship Enterprise. Its continuing mission to explore strange new worlds, seek out new life and new civilizations, to boldly go where nowhere has gone before. Amen. So that's Star Trek, and nothing about that, but what I just said or quoted was military. Meanwhile, they all got the uniform on. Okay, Star Wars. Hello, Star Wars. Sounds like military science fiction. It's not really. It's high fantasy. However, I would say that Rogue One would qualify as military science fiction because it's a military unit solving a military problem in a military sort of manner. So that's how I look at it. And then it's kind of important to know what's not. I mean, you look at MASH. No one says MASH is military fiction. It's a hospital with rank on it. So.
Well, that's a tough act to follow. I can only really echo what was already said. It's a military-centric story that's doing things that only the military would do. But what's a nice twist on that is sticking those guys in situations where they have to utilize skills that where you don't have a military. That resonates with a wider audience than just your niche military readers.
I think to me, part of it is that the character development in a military sci-fi is done through the crucible of war. You put people into bad situations and make them fight their way out, literally. There's also a little bit more of a focus on the importance of group rather than the importance of just one person. And you get people that do things for the betterment of the group rather than just for themselves. There's a very strong self-sacrifice. And that's something that I try and put into all of mine, where people are doing things for the betterment of the unit, not just themselves.
One of the criticisms that some people give to military science fiction is that it's war porn. And they object to the people getting blown up all the time and everything like that. So my question to all of you is, how do you handle death? And I think we'll start with Ken.
I write to torture my main characters, so that's who you're following through the story. And I directly correlate how that death is going to affect him, because that's how you experience it. So I don't have a large body count at the end of my books, but I do try and make it on a personal level. So when somebody actually dies, it doesn't matter, because eventually, when it doesn't matter, you've lost engagement with the people who are reading your stories.
And I think that's the issue of self-sacrifice, making their death worthwhile. But it is definitely part of war. You know, it's great if you can go through a battle and not lose anyone, but how often does that happen, especially in major war? So we do have people die in our books. I think my personal best is 25 red shirts I killed in one. Not that I was counting or wanted to, but you know, they all needed to die to advance the story. And it's very rare that somebody doesn't, because it's war. And if you can get through the war without losing anybody, how hard was it? I mean, is that realistic? Is that life? That doesn't really go with any war that, you know, I've participated in. So it's sometimes, I don't want to say a necessary part of it, but you know, it definitely is part of war.
I've seen it done two different ways. I definitely agree with the sentiment that you need to try to make the death worth something. Now, some people will object and say that's not really realistic, because in war, people die for any number of reasons. Part of what people struggle with is sometimes deaths are meaningless. Like, the guy gets run over by a Humvee in the middle of the night because of a stupid accident, and the route was changed. And I mean, I've sat across the table from people who've told me these stories about their friends dying in senseless, stupid, accidental ways, and that does happen. You can do that in your story, but you risk your readers having potentially a really bad reaction to that. Now, on the other hand, some readers will say, no, that's exactly realistic. That's exactly how it happened to me when I was in OIF or something like that, and they'll lock in. So you have to kind of, I think, choose what you want to do. But for me, especially if you're writing an epic war story, where you're really striving for like a big picture, dramatic, you know, maybe Star Wars or something like that, you know, the death has to mean something. The person is either sacrificing to save his friends or the cohort, or maybe he's sacrificing to make up for past failure. I think that could be really powerful, because if they've shown a moment of cowardice, or they've made a mistake in judgment, especially a leader, you know, you have those kind of things in war stories where the leader will make a really stupid judgment error. Maybe it gets some people killed, and then he or she is guilty and feels bad, and suddenly that moment arrives in the story where they have a chance to make up for it, and it's going to cost them their life. But for your reader, that will ring true, if that makes sense. I don't know if I'm using that word where it makes sense, but it'll ring true that that person is trying to pay the debt, so to speak.
So anytime you've got a chance to kill a character however you want, just know you as the writer, this is your opportunity to kick your reader in the emotional jimmy. So put on some steel-toed boots and do it well. So, and also one thing to consider is how the aftermath of someone dying in a battle. And because a lot of times you'll go through a fiction and someone dies, it's like, oh, he's gone, and then people just drive on. You should give your characters a chance to go, Jesus Christ, Bob's gone. You know, pour a little something for him, or however they're going to react to or deal with that death. And that, you know, with that, one, you kicked him in the jimmy, and then two, okay, now you can comfort the reader at the same time you're comforting all your characters after they react to that. So that's something you can put in your process.
One of the other aspects that seems to be prevalent in military science fiction is the use of military jargon. And you have people who served and probably understand a lot of it, and people who haven't served may not understand it. So how do you handle, or do you make use of military jargon, and if so, how do you handle it, Richard?
I try to keep it as jargon-free as possible. I used to be a field artillery officer, and if you got as a random civilian and threw them into a fire direction center and tried to have them explain what happened over the course of 10 minutes, they would walk out saying, they're speaking Greek. And so the more jargon you put in, the more opportunities you have to lose a reader. So you can have, you know, some decent, you know, probably well known, like who knows what a REMF is? R-E-M-F, okay, not everyone, not everyone, but you could probably explain it. Like if you have that one character who's new or who's a cherry and shows up and you're like, get that REMF out of here, what's a REMF? Well, let me tell you. And then you can introduce some dialogue that way if you have a character who's new to the situation. But the more, you know, jargon you put in, the more chance you have to lose a reader who's going like, I don't know what's going on.
We've lost some right now, so why don't you tell them what it is?
Which one?
So
Rear echelon.
REMF is. Can I be vulgar? Should I not be vulgar? You know that's where. So that came out really in Vietnam. Rear echelon motherfucker, or which in current terms is POG. I'm a POG. I'll out myself. So POG is a person other than grunt. Basically, somebody who's not a frontline person suffering in the fight. And it's you know, if you're going to have those characters in your stories, you should have those characters in your stories. How you treat them is completely up to you. And where the jargon is concerned, I think here's something I want to caution people on, especially if you've not been in the military and you don't have that direct experience. Don't worry about getting sharp-shooted or sharp-shot. Maybe I don't know how you say that. Don't worry about the snipers. And there will be snipers. No matter how well you write your story, some person is going to come out of the woodwork in a review on Amazon and say, you got this detail wrong because I was in 3rd Special Forces, blah, 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 blah. You're never going to make that person happy. Don't worry about making that person happy. That person is not your audience. Your audience is the big audience. And your big audience, I agree with Richard, is probably not going to be overly thrilled with tons of jargon. If you put jargon in there, try to quickly give it context so they can figure it out without necessarily explaining it. You know, if you give them context, they can generally figure it out, and then don't thwap them in the face with it, because I think as military geeks especially, sometimes we become enamored of the jargon, and that can hurt us when we're trying to just tell the story.
My first book, I wrote without a single swear word in it, because I had just been an elementary school principal, and I knew some of the kids would probably read it, and so I intentionally didn't use a single curse word in it, and I gave it to my mom to read, and she said, "Wow, I really like that book, but there's a problem." And I said, "What's the problem?" She said, "There's no cursing." And I said, "Well, yeah, but because, you know," and she says, "Chris, you were in the military for 20 years. You know that soldiers and sailors curse. If you want it to be realistic, you need to put some in there." So if my books have too much swearing, blame my mom. But, you know, soldiers and sailors are going to use acronyms. And to have them spell out things when it's supposed to be an acronym is going to appear odd. For example, the MECA that we use is a Combat Assault System Personnel. So it's a CASPER, and we talk about CASPERs. You know, so there are some things that you know, are going to be odd if you don't. So, you know, yes, I use them. I try to, you know, explain what they are, or at least break out the acronym so that people know and can follow along. But I think there's, you know, just by necessity of being a real authenticity, you know, Mil Sci-Fi, it's going to have some.
I'm not in the military, so I didn't even know what that was. I use minimal jargon, and I invent my own, because what's always in my mind when I'm writing a story is I want to deliver to a wide audience, not the super niche. And the same applies to how much science you want in your science fiction. You know, I'm not here to give you a textbook. I'm here to give you an experience, and that's always first and foremost as how I'm going to weigh how technical, whether it's jargon or actual science-based stuff in front of you. And it's also from the perspective of the character and what their expertise is. That always is going to influence it.
There seems to be two ways of general ways of writing military science fiction. One is that you take today's U.S. Marine Corps, pick it up, shift it over 1,000 years, and plop it down on a spaceship or a different planet. The other way is to create completely new militaries, new weapons and things like that that don't really relate as much to the current day. So I'd like to ask the panelists, which way do you prefer, and what are some of the pros and cons of doing each way, Chris?
Well, I think the most important thing is to orient the reader and let them know, you know, what you're doing. So in many cases, it's easiest and they have a frame of reference if you take today's stuff and dump it in 1,000 years from now. There may be other reasons to not, and ultimately it's all about the story. Sometimes you want the readers to understand that they're in a very different place. And in that case you would use, you could use different ranks, different structures, different whatever. But it's all about the story and what makes sense. Are you trying to orient the reader and get them acclimated quickly so you can get into the good stuff? Because having to explain this whole new rank structure takes time, and it keeps you from getting into the good stuff. So could be done either way depending on the story.
I don't want to reinvent the wheel. I mean, people, they know the basic rank structure if they're a fan of the genre. And I'm not ready. When I think of making up my own rank structure, I think of epic fantasy, where you're setting up this huge type of world. And I don't know many military science fiction series that do something like that. Now, I'm sure everyone can go call something out, but I mean, for the general reader that I'm trying to reach, I need for them to have some basis in it. Otherwise, I'm spending a whole book explaining a rank structure, and I don't know how important that is. I mean, the jobs that are there today are probably going to exist, but they might change just a little bit, and that's more important than giving you a vocabulary to learn in order for you to enjoy my story.
I'm of the opinion things won't change too much. In England, not too long ago, there was an archaeologist up on Hadrian's Wall, and they found a bit of parchment that was over 1,000 years old. And what it was is a bill done out to a Roman legionnaire, making him buy new equipment that he had somehow lost or needed to get replaced. So in the Army, we call this the green weenie, and we always say the green weenie is going to get you. Okay, so it's gotten me before. It got that guy. 1,000 years from now, there's going to be some poor schlub that loses his plasma rifle batteries, and he's going to, his LES is 0. So leave an earnings statement, your pay slip in the Army. So I don't think things will change too much, and it's better. I prefer not to make the readers reinvent the wheel with me during the course of the story.
Yeah, good old statement of charges. I agree with Richard. I think, again, there's two ways you could do it. I think you will achieve instant verisimilitude. I think I'm saying that right. If you just stick with what we know. Familiar ranks, familiar organizational interactivity, and really you can achieve that, again, like he said, if you inject familiar problems, which will never go away. I'm a firm believer that human nature doesn't change. We're the same people we've been for 100,000 years, and we will be 10,000 years in the future. That will greatly influence how your military works, regardless of what you call a captain in the year 3955. It's still going to operate the same. The people are going to still have the same problems, the same ambition, the same jealousy, the same incompetence, really the same incompetence. In fact, I'm just going to emphasize, put incompetence in your story at multiple levels. That will almost write your story for you, because so much of what goes on in the actual day-to-day military is recovering from somebody else's incompetence. I think that matters way more than having a strange or bizarre or newly inventive rank structure, or having the military work in a way that it just, sometimes I've read some books, and I won't name names, but in fact there's one really, really well-known one where I read it and I was like, there's no way these people would behave like this. There's just no way, because it wasn't true to my experience, and it isn't. I mean, it was a bit of wish fulfillment, I think, on the author's part, but I just didn't see it happening.
I'd like to know how the panelists handle tropes. I mean, in military science fiction, there's the brand new second lieutenant. There's the guy who gets a letter from home the day before he rotates out of combat. How do you handle the tropes? Do you try to follow them? Do you try to break them? Do you ignore them? And we'll go back to Brad on this.
I don't think I ignore them. I do steer away from the really tired ones. I think the green second lieutenant has been done to death. That's just my personal opinion. Now you might have a particular spin on it that is completely original and goes gangbusters. I'm not saying don't try it, but for me personally, I steer away from the incompetent young officer. I do use the experienced NCO who is kind of the dad of the platoon or the dad of the company, because that's been true to my experience. There's always, or usually, hopefully, there will be that experienced older person, could be male, could be female, I don't think it really matters, who is the guide. That person has been downrange or has done things, and I think that's really important to have that. Otherwise, again, it comes down to your specific experience and what kind of story you want to tell. The tropes are a trope for a reason, because they work. Plenty of people have had experience with bad young officers who just don't have the experience, but they have too much ego, right? So they say, I'm in charge, and all their decision making is wrong because they don't listen to that experienced NCO. But that is a trope for a reason, because that really does happen. It's what kind of people do you want to put in your story? How do you want to populate it? Is it going to be a super soldier unit where everybody is super elite? Or is it going to be a MASH unit where everybody's kind of a bumbling, doesn't want to be there, hates the military? You can tell these kind of stories, and they will all be true to somebody out there, either because of their own specific military experience or because they find that picture of people fascinating.
I don't consciously use tropes, but I know that I really enjoy the smart-ass soldier who's a borderline criminal, and we've all had them working for us. And sometimes we're like, I'm gonna keep you around because I know you can find stuff. And other times, like, I couldn't ignore what you just did. The colonel saw you do it, and so it's I like that kind of character. And then if you see a trope, the important thing is don't have your character wearing that trope, on their chest or beaming off their forehead. Just mash it down a little bit. And they're there for a reason. Archetypes are there for a reason. Certain structures are there for a reason. They're not necessarily to be avoided, and don't subvert those expectations, dear God. So just keep them in mind, and don't try to be too obvious about it. That's my opinion.
Yeah, sometimes I think about tropes, and you can create instant conflict by playing tropes against each other. I mean, you can essentially write whole scenes based on that type of conflict. I mean, for an example, you have, nobody wants to spend money on the military, so you always have a critic against the military, and then you have the guy that says, well, do you want to live? You have to do X, Y, and Z. That is a trope that you definitely can connect with today's world. That's going to be prevalent, for thousands of years. As long as there's some kind of currency, there's some kind of cost, whether it is currency or not, there is always a cost. So yes, use tropes, but I do think you should be sparing with them, because if you put too many in there, people are going to be like, yeah, this is crap, and it probably is. Sorry.
Yeah, create your own stuff. Don't just build something out of what everybody else has done. I agree. Yes. You're probably going to have some tropes because, like Brad said, they're there because they're real life. If you had a second lieutenant show up who knows everything and does everything well, the reader would be like, huh? How does that work? Because anybody that's been in the military knows, you show up without a whole lot of knowledge and experience and skills, and you can either be the person that tries to do it without listening to people and is the bumbling junior officer, or you can be the one that's smart enough to take the advice and be successful. And both of those have purposes in stories, just depending on the story you want to tell.
Okay, we've got a little bit of time left. I'm going to skip down to, I want each of the panelists to give one piece of advice to somebody who is starting out on writing their military fiction, and we'll go over here to Chris again.
Write the damn story. Okay? Write the story till the end. Anything can be fixed in editing. If you're not military, you don't know military, write the story, then you can get that part fixed and you can adapt it. Don't get hung up in the minutia. Write the story all the way to the end and then fix it.
Thanks. If you've never written anything before, keep it simple. You're not going to write Tolkien as your first series. It's just not going to happen. So definitely keep it simple. I would focus on one branch of the military and tell your stories set from that perspective rather than try to include everything, because I'm not in the military and there's no way I'm going to know how these guys interplay. It would require a lot of research that I may not want to do for my first book. Read a lot. Read people who are actually selling. I don't mean people who are just popular with other authors. You want to emulate the people who are reaching readers. That is of paramount importance. And I don't mean the one-hit wonders. I mean sustainability for years and years. Those are the people you want to pay attention to, because they're writing something that has an audience that is definitely hungry for that type of story.
Well, I'm going to get into something a little more esoteric, because military science fiction, you're going to deal with leadership, and you deal with leadership challenges. There is a podcast by a former Navy SEAL by the name of Jocko Willink. Jocko Willink, okay? Every leadership issue you think you could have in a unit, Jocko's talked about it from a Navy SEAL, I've done too many burpees this morning perspective. So if you've got, you're like, I really need a leadership challenge, go to the Jocko Willink podcast, go to on YouTube, search what you think your problem is. Jocko's probably talked to you about it. He's probably given it from a point of view you never would have thought of. So I would recommend looking at his podcast, looking at his books, they're very good.
Go back to the books you've loved, reread them, especially the ones that have sold very, very well, and reread them with an eye to figuring out what in the story, what are the elements that that just pushed your buttons and hit your cookies and really set you off. Why do you love that book? Could be Ender's Game, it could be Dune, I don't care what book it is. Somewhere in your reading history, you've read a military science fiction book that just wowed you. Go back and reread it once or twice or even 3 times and do it with an eye to, okay, what in this book turned me on, and then use that as fodder for developing your book or your series.
And that leads us to my last question before we open it up to the audience. What is that one book that you would suggest that people would read before they embark on their journey? Ken?
My first military sci-fi that I read was Honor Harrington. The first 5 books were amazing, and that's my go-to. So that's my suggestion.
I'm going to go, when he asked the question, the first one that popped into my mind was Gust Front by John Ringo. Great job. John Ringo was a grunt, and he totally understands it. And the interaction between the people in it is spot
on. I want to say Starship Troopers, but it's a great book, and it's got a great message. It's got some really great action at the beginning and at the very end. However, if you go through and try to rewrite Starship Troopers now, it's going to be a slog, because Starship Troopers is very much message fiction. Robert Heinlein got pissed off about some treaty we did with the Russians. For 2 weeks he was just doing this, communism is evil. And that's how we got Starship Troopers. So it's still brilliant, it still captures everything it needs to, but the kind of the structure of it. So when you read Starship Troopers and you think, wow, I liked how these soldiers worked, you glom onto that. Not so much of action in the beginning, whole lots of talking, action at the end. That's a structure that may not work.
I'm going to pitch, I can't finger one specific book, but I'm going to finger 2 specific authors. Chris Bunch and Alan Cole. Chris Bunch was a Ranger qualified, went to Vietnam. Alan Cole was a hippie and was not. They were best friends, they were writers. They wrote, in my opinion, some of the best military fiction and science fiction I've ever seen. One was nominated for a Pulitzer. It was called A Reckoning for Kings. I cannot recommend that highly enough. It's a Vietnam War novel. It gets it so spot on. And then they wrote what's called the Sten series, S-T-E-N. The first 6 books in that are brilliant military science fiction. I can't recommend it highly enough.
Okay, we just have a few minutes left, so if we have any questions from the audience, please go ahead.
My question to y'all is now I understand, you know, it just came out of Chris Fox's talk about running. I'm sorry?
Here, take the mic.
All right. Just came out of Chris Fox's talk about writing the market, right, and understanding reader expectations. And so I hesitate to use the word formulaic, but you know, readers of military science fiction probably have certain expectations, things they want to see in a military science fiction book, right? Space Marines doing Space Marine things, you know, basic training, you know, Iron Dragoons and Chaplains of War. We all have the basic training guide coming up and this and that before the grand adventure. My question to y'all is, have you ever experimented with like kind of an unorthodox military science fiction story? You know, like you mentioned Rogue One, which is really a group of terrorists, not a military unit. And you know, like Apocalypse Now, it's a military story, but it's a very unorthodox military story. It's more of a psychological trip, if you will, that happens to you know, a military man in a military setting. So, you know, have you ever experimented with an unorthodox approach to a military story like that, that isn't just a squad going and doing squad things, but it's a soldier who's, you know, but it's a different kind of tale. And if you have experimented with that, how have your readers reacted?
Yeah, I can speak to that because that was my premise for my series. I took a military guy and I stuck him on a colony ship against his will, and he has to find a life on this colony that was designed not to have a military, which is kind of stupid, but you know, and readers loved it. That's why it did so as well as it does. So you can definitely play with these things, and you can find an audience that other people didn't anticipate.
You mentioned Chaplain's War. That was my first novel, which was not a novel in the beginning. It appeared in Analog magazine as 2 connected pieces of short fiction, and I did exactly what you described. It was not a frontline guy. It was literally a chaplain's assistant, and that was the first story. And the way he approaches the war that he's in is not about a squad going forth into the jungle or anything like that. So, and it all came back from a study I had seen about Vietnam, about how prisoners of war in Vietnam did better if they had some kind of religious background versus not. That was the kernel of the story. And it just ballooned up into this thing. It won Reader's Choice Award and got a lot of recognition. And I didn't intend to do all that in the beginning, but it started with just a premise that was way off the usual map.
Yeah, normally I like to think of that Terry Crews moment in his commercials where he's going, explosions! Just like that. I keep that kind of foremost when I'm writing, but as far as doing something experimental, I haven't done it yet. One day I'm going to write this Darkman meets Universal Soldier meets this RoboCop story. It'll be brilliant. It sounds crazy now, but that someday I'll write that, but I'm waiting until I've got a lot more of a backlist to fall back on, and people go, what? And don't buy it. So.
And for my part, I have a story where, and I don't want to spoil it, but you know, he spends a lot of time trying to accomplish this goal, and at the end of the book, fails.
And I'll add that I have a book called Conscientious Objector. The guy is in the military as a conscientious objector. The people who have contacted me love it. It has not sold nearly as well as my others. We got time really quick. Terry, if you got that quick question.
I do. I write space opera. I can talk loud enough for everybody. I write space opera. It has military elements inside of it. Some of the characters are military, some of them are not. I chart on both of the charts, and I always wonder, is it really military science fiction, even though it's being shelved there by Amazon, or am I just kind of creeping in where I shouldn't be in that? I just wonder, how wide is military space opera for you guys?
Anybody got a quick answer to that?
it's as wide as you want it to be. I mean, I think Star Wars changed the game because Star Wars made everybody on the planet a military science fiction fan, and everybody on the planet knows Star Wars. It is.
And can fight with a lightsaber.
I think that just changed everything for the readership and for popular audience imagination. So it can be as wide as you want, and you can really mash it up.
Okay. Thank you very much for coming to this. Hopefully you got something out of it. And onward and upwards.